They burned what little she had left, just because she fed a starving man one bowl of soup, and by sunrise, the same land they left in ashes would fall silent under the weight of 400 men kneeling. The wind moved slow across the dry field that morning, dragging dust in thin lines over cracked earth that hadn't seen proper rain in near 6 months, and Margaret Hale stood in the middle of it with nothing but a dented iron pot hanging from her hand, and the faint smell of smoke still clinging to her dress, her boots half buried in the soft gray remains of what used to be her barn, her fence, her life. And if you had passed by an hour earlier, you might have thought she was just another widow, worn thin by time, another forgotten name on the edge of a dying town somewhere between nowhere and gone. But there was something in the way she stood, still as a fence post under a heavy sky, that told a different story, something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that comes after a choice you can't take back, the kind that lingers longer than regret. 24 hours earlier, that same wind had carried a different sound, something weaker, uneven, the kind of breath that didn't belong to the land, but was trying to hold on to it anyway, and Margaret had heard it from her porch while stirring what little broth she could manage from bones and a handful of dried beans, the steam rising thin and stubborn into the late afternoon light. And she could have ignored it, same as most folks would, same as the town had taught her to do ever since the raids years back. Ever since names like Apache started being spoken with tight jaws and loaded hands. But Margaret Hale had lived long enough to know that hunger didn't wear a uniform and dying didn't ask permission. So she set the spoon down, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped off that porch into a truth she hadn't yet seen. He was there by the fence line, slumped against the warped wood like something the land itself had spit out, his clothes torn, his skin marked with dust and distance, and his eyes, dark, steady, and nearly gone, found hers without asking, without pleading, just waiting, and that was the part that stayed with her, not fear, not anger, just waiting, like a man who had already accepted the answer before it was given. And for a moment Margaret stood there, feeling the weight of every story she'd been told, every warning whispered in church halls and trading posts, every quiet agreement that some lines were not meant to be crossed. And she could hear them even then, the voices of neighbors, of the sheriff, of men who believed kindness had a cost too high to pay. But then the wind shifted, carrying with it that same fragile breath, thinner now, and Margaret did what she had always done when the world tried to tell her who deserved to live and who didn't. She stepped forward. The soup was still warm when she brought it to him, held carefully in that old iron pot her husband had once traded 2 weeks' wages for back when things still had shape. And she knelt without a word, her joints stiff but certain, dipping the spoon and holding it out, close enough for him to take, far enough to leave him his dignity. And when he did, when his hand closed around that simple offering, something passed between them that no one else would have seen, no grand gesture, no spoken thanks, just a quiet exchange carried on breath and survival. And Margaret watched as he ate, slow at first, then steadier, like the act itself was remembering him back into the world. He didn't tell her his name, and she didn't ask, but before the last light slipped behind the ridge, he left something behind, placed carefully beside the empty pot, a small object wrapped in worn leather, no bigger than a man's palm, and Margaret noticed it only after he had gone, his footsteps fading into the same dust he came from, and she picked it up with hands that had known both loss and labor, turning it over once before setting it by the door. Not as payment, not as a question, just as something that belonged to a moment she hadn't yet understood. Night came harder than usual, not with the quiet she was used to, but with whispers carried between houses, with shadows that lingered longer than they should, and somewhere past midnight, the first stone struck her fence, followed by another, then the low crackle of something catching where it shouldn't, and Margaret stood in the doorway, watching the edge of her world give way to firelight and judgment, her face lit in orange and ash. But she did not step back, did not speak, did not run, because some things, once chosen, ask you to stand still and see them through. By morning, there was nothing left to lose, and yet the land felt different, heavier somehow, as if it were holding its breath, and Margaret stood there in that empty field, the small leather-wrapped token resting in her hand, the wind gone quiet, the horizon blurred by something rising in the distance, not smoke this time, not fire, but movement, low and steady, growing with each passing second, and she didn't move, didn't turn, just watched as the dust began to take shape into something no one in that town had ever seen arrive without fear, and still, she stayed. The dust did not rise like a storm, not wild, not careless, but in long steady lines that stretched across the horizon as if the earth itself had decided to move. And Margaret Hale watched without blinking, her fingers closing slowly around the small leather-wrapped object in her palm, the edges worn smooth from years she did not know, the weight of it light yet certain, like something that had traveled far with purpose. And as the shapes began to form within that low drifting haze, she could hear it before she could fully see it, the quiet rhythm of hooves meeting dry ground in perfect measure, not rushed, not scattered, but deliberate, like a heartbeat carried across miles. And behind her, though she did not turn, the town had begun to gather, drawn by the same silence that had settled over the field, doors opening one by one, boots stepping cautiously onto wooden porches, voices held back in throats that had grown too used to speaking before thinking, and for the first time in a long while, no one called out her name, no one shouted blame, because whatever was coming did not belong to them, and they knew it. The figures grew clearer with every passing second, riders first, then more behind them, rows unfolding like something practiced, something remembered, until the full weight of it stood before her, hundreds of men moving as one across the open land that had been empty only hours before, their presence filling the space without a single raised voice, without a single sign of threat, and still Margaret did not step back, though the air had changed, grown heavier, thicker with something she could not name, but could feel settle into her chest, steadying her rather than shaking her. And when the first rider reached the edge of what had once been her fence, he did not cross it, did not press forward, but stopped, his horse lowering its head slightly, as if it too understood the line that remained even after the wood had burned away. There was a pause then, a long breath held between two worlds, and in that stillness Margaret became aware of the object in her hand again, of the way it seemed warmer now than it had been before, as though it carried something beyond itself, and she looked down at it for the first time since the night, her thumb brushing along the leather tie before loosening it slowly, not out of urgency, not out of fear, but because the moment had asked her to. And inside, she found a small piece of silver, shaped not into anything grand, not into wealth or decoration, but into something simple and precise, a narrow pendant etched with lines that curved like wind over sand, markings she did not understand but recognized in the way one recognizes meaning without knowing the language. And as she lifted it slightly into the morning light, something shifted among the riders, not movement in the way of preparation, but in the way of acknowledgement, subtle, shared, and the man at the front, older than the rest, his hair bound back with quiet care, inclined his head just enough to be seen. Behind Margaret, the townspeople had moved closer now, drawn despite themselves, their earlier certainty replaced by something uneasy, something that did not sit well in the stories they had told each other for years, and she could feel their eyes on her back, could almost hear the questions forming, the same ones they had thrown like stones the night before, only now without the force to carry them. And still she did not turn, because whatever this was, it was not theirs to understand first. The older man dismounted slowly, his boots meeting the earth without sound, and he walked forward alone, each step measured, each breath steady, until he stood a few feet from where the line of her life had once been marked by wood and wire. And for a moment he said nothing, his gaze resting not on the ashes, not on the town behind her, but on Margaret herself, as if measuring something far beyond what could be seen. And then his eyes dropped briefly to the silver in her hand, and in that small movement something passed between them that felt older than either of them, older than the land even, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. He placed his hand over his chest, not as a claim, not as a warning, but as a gesture of something Margaret had not seen directed at her in a long time. And when he lowered himself to one knee, the motion was slow, deliberate, carrying with it a weight that settled over the field like the first drop of rain after a long drought, and behind him, as if guided by a single breath, the others followed, one by one, then in rows, until the entire horizon bent downward in quiet unison, hundreds of men, lowering themselves to the ground before a woman who had nothing left to offer them but what she had already given. And the sound that followed was not loud, not overwhelming, but soft, the shift of fabric, the press of boots into dust, the kind of sound that could be missed if one was not listening for it. But Margaret heard it, felt it, and for the first time since the fire, her grip on the pendant loosened just slightly, not from weakness, but from the realization that whatever had been taken from her had not been the whole of what she carried. For a long moment, no one spoke, not the riders, not the townspeople gathered behind her, not even the wind that had finally stilled, as if it too understood that this was not a moment to be disturbed. And Margaret Hale stood there with the silver pendant resting lightly against her palm, watching as 400 men remained lowered before her in a silence that carried more weight than any words she had heard in years. And it did not feel like power. It did not feel like victory. It felt like something else entirely, something quieter, something that reached deeper than pride and settled somewhere closer to memory. The older man who had stepped forward remained kneeling only a breath longer than the rest before rising again with the same measured calm, his eyes lifting to meet hers, not with demand, not with expectation, but with something steady and clear, the kind of gaze that did not rush a moment that mattered. And when he spoke, his voice was low, shaped carefully around each word as though he respected the language he was using as much as the person he spoke to. "You gave food when there was none to spare," he said, and though the words were simple, they seemed to carry more than their meaning, as if they were being repeated from somewhere else, from someone else, carried across distance the same way the riders had come, and Margaret felt her breath catch slightly at the sound, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said, like a truth being returned rather than offered. She did not answer right away, not because she did not have words, but because she understood that this was not a conversation that needed many, and instead she looked down again at the pendant, turning it once between her fingers before holding it out just slightly, enough for him to see that she had opened it, that she had not hidden what had been given, and the man nodded once, slow and certain, as though that small action confirmed something larger than either of them had spoken aloud. "He could not speak last night," the man continued, his eyes shifting briefly toward the rows behind him where the younger riders stood among the others, no longer slumped, no longer fading, but upright and present, his gaze lowered in a way that spoke not of weakness, but of respect, and Margaret recognized him then, not by his face alone, but by the stillness he carried, the same quiet waiting she had seen at her fence line. Only now it was steadier, grounded, like a man who had returned to himself, and she felt something inside her ease, something she had not realized had been held tight since the night before. "He told us what you did," the older man said, "and what you lost because of it." And there was no accusation in his voice, no edge of anger directed toward the town behind her, only a statement, clear and unmoving. And Margaret became aware then of the people at her back again, of the way they had drawn closer without stepping forward, their presence now uncertain, their earlier certainty gone, replaced by a quiet that did not belong to them. And for the first time, she did not feel their judgment pressing against her shoulders. It had loosened, shifted, as if it no longer knew where to stand. The older man stepped forward one pace, careful not to cross the place where her fence had been, honoring a boundary that no longer existed except in memory, and he extended his hand slightly, not reaching for her, but offering something unseen, something carried not in objects but in intention, and Margaret understood without needing it explained that this moment was not about repayment in the way the town might measure it, not about replacing what had burned or filling what had been emptied. It was about something else, something that did not leave marks that could be counted or stored. Behind him, the rows of men remained still, their presence no longer overwhelming, but grounding, like the land itself had risen to stand with her rather than against her. And the young man she had fed finally lifted his eyes, meeting hers for the first time since the night. And there was no fear there now, no fading breath, only a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them as clearly as if it had been spoken. And Margaret felt the weight in her chest shift again, not disappearing, but changing shape into something she could carry. She closed her fingers around the pendant once more, then lowered her hand slowly to her side, not keeping it hidden, not displaying it, simply holding it as part of herself now. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady, shaped by years of choosing when to speak and when to let silence carry the rest. "I only did what was right," she said, and the words did not sound like a defense, did not sound like an explanation. They settled into the space between them like something already understood, and the older man inclined his head again, not in agreement, but in recognition, as if acknowledging that what she had done did not need to be measured to be known. The air shifted slightly then, not with tension, but with release, and somewhere behind her, a board creaked under shifting weight as one of the townspeople adjusted their stance, uncertain now not of what they were seeing, but of what it meant, and Margaret did not turn to look, because for the first time in a long while, she did not need to see their faces to understand that something had changed, not in the land, not in the riders before her, but in the space where judgment had once stood so firmly. And in that quiet, she realized that what had been taken from her the night before had not left her empty. It had cleared something, made room for something that could not have stood there otherwise, and as the sun lifted a little higher over the dry field, casting light across the rows of men and the ashes at her feet alike, Margaret Hale stood not as a woman who had lost everything, but as someone who had been seen, fully and without condition, and that, more than anything the town had ever given or taken, was something that would remain. No one in the town remembered when they had last seen silence hold this long without breaking, not with a cough, not with a whisper, not even with the restless shifting that usually came when people stood too close to something they did not understand. And yet here they were, gathered behind Margaret Hale, watching a field that had been nothing but ash at dawn now, filled with something far heavier than smoke, something that did not sting the eyes but settled deeper, into the chest, into the part of a person that kept count of right and wrong even when the world refused to agree. And Margaret felt it too, not as pressure, not as fear, but as a steady presence that asked nothing from her except that she remain as she was, unmoved, unhidden, exactly where she had chosen to stand. The older man's hand lowered slowly from his chest, the gesture complete without needing anything returned, and for a moment he simply studied her again, not in curiosity, not in doubt, but in a way that suggested he was committing something to memory, something that would be carried beyond this field, beyond this day. And then he turned slightly, just enough for his voice to carry back toward the rows behind him without needing to rise. And though Margaret did not understand the words that followed, she understood the effect, the way the air shifted again, not with tension, but with readiness, as if something long prepared had finally been given permission to begin. The men behind him did not stand all at once, not in a rush, but in a sequence that moved like a slow tide, each one rising with the same care they had shown in kneeling. And as they did, a new sound entered the field, soft at first, almost lost beneath the open sky. The creak of leather, the faint jingle of metal, the quiet movement of hands reaching for things carried across miles. And Margaret watched as the first of them stepped forward, not crossing the line where her fence had once stood, but stopping just short of it. And from the saddle behind him, another man lifted down a bundle, wrapped in canvas worn smooth by travel, placing it gently on the ground before stepping back again without a word. One became two, then three, then more, each man moving in turn, each bundle set down with the same careful attention, until a row began to form along the edge of her land, not thrown, not dropped, but placed, one after another, as if the ground itself deserved respect, as if what they were leaving behind was not a gift, but something being returned to its rightful place. And Margaret did not move to inspect them, did not step forward to open what had been brought, because she understood that this was not about what was inside those wrappings. It was about the act itself, the quiet insistence that what had been taken from her did not end her story, that loss did not have the final word. Behind her, the town could no longer hold its silence entirely, a low murmur beginning to rise, not loud, not bold, but uncertain, shaped by confusion more than anything else. And Margaret could hear the edges of it, the disbelief, the questions forming without answers. And she knew without turning that the same people who had stood in judgment the night before now stood unsure of where to place their eyes, unsure of what this meant for the stories they had told about her, about the man she had helped, about the lines they believed could not be crossed without consequence. And for the first time, she felt no need to answer them, no need to explain, because whatever understanding was needed here did not belong to words spoken from a porch or shouted across a street. It belonged to this moment, to what was being done without demand, without pride. The young man stepped forward then, the one she had found at her fence, and though he moved with strength now, there was no trace of haste in him, no urgency to claim attention, and when he reached the place where the older man had stood, he stopped, lowering his gaze once more before placing something at the very front of the row, something smaller than the rest, wrapped not in canvas, but in cloth dyed a deep, quiet color. And for a moment he hesitated, not from doubt, but from the weight of what it meant to leave it there, and then he stepped back, returning to his place without looking up again. Margaret felt her breath shift slightly at that, not catching, not tightening, just changing, like the first cool breeze after a long day under a hard sun, and she took one step forward, just one, her boots pressing into the ash that still covered the ground, and she stopped at the line that had once been her fence, honoring it the same way they had, and she looked down at what had been placed before her, not opening anything yet, not reaching for the nearest bundle, but simply seeing it, the care in the way it had been set down, the quiet intention behind it. And she understood then that this was not an ending to what had happened the night before. It was a continuation, a response that did not mirror what had been done to her, but answered it with something entirely different, something that did not erase the loss but refused to let it define her. The older man watched her for a moment longer, then inclined his head once more, not as a farewell, not as a conclusion, but as a recognition that what needed to be done here had been done, and he turned back toward his horse, his movements as steady as before, and one by one, the others followed, mounting without noise, without urgency, until the field began to empty the same way it had filled, in quiet, measured motion, leaving behind not absence, but presence, something that would remain long after the last rider had disappeared beyond the rise. And Margaret Hale stood there at the edge of her land, the small silver pendant still in her hand, the line of offerings before her, and the town behind her held in a silence that no longer belonged to fear, but to something closer to understanding, even if they had not yet found the words for it. The last rider disappeared over the low rise just as the wind found its way back across the field, gentle at first, brushing through the scattered ash and the newly placed bundles alike as if testing what had changed, and Margaret Hale remained where she stood, her boots steady at the edge of where her fence had once drawn a line between her life and everything beyond it, her hand still closed loosely around the small silver pendant, its surface now warmed by her skin, and for a moment she did nothing, did not move toward the bundles, did not turn toward the town, because something in her understood that rushing this moment would break it, that whatever had been given here required the same quiet patience it had arrived with. Behind her, the murmur that had begun earlier shifted again, no longer uncertain but searching, as if the people gathered there were trying to find their place in a story that had moved forward without them. And she could hear the shuffle of boots on dry boards, the low clearing of throats, the hesitant steps that brought them closer to the field without quite stepping into it. And still no one called out to her. No one offered explanation or apology, because some silences are not empty. They are full of things that have not yet found the courage to be spoken. Margaret let out a slow breath she had not realized she had been holding, the air leaving her chest in a way that felt lighter than before, and she looked down at the nearest bundle, its canvas edges folded with care, tied with a simple cord that had been knotted and then tucked in so it would not unravel on its own, and she crouched slowly, her knees stiff but certain, and reached out with one hand, her fingers brushing the fabric first, feeling the weight of it, the texture, the presence of something real beneath it, and then she loosened the cord, not pulling it apart but untying it, as if respecting the way it had been secured, and when the cloth opened, she did not draw back in surprise, did not gasp or call out. She simply looked, taking in what had been placed there with the same steady attention she had given the man at her fence the night before. Inside was food, simple and clean, dried meat wrapped carefully, small sacks of grain tied tight against the dust, a canteen filled to the brim, and beneath it all, folded cloth that spoke of use rather than show, things meant to last, things meant to be used, and Margaret's hand hovered over it for a moment before resting lightly on the edge of the bundle, not claiming it, not yet, but acknowledging it, and she felt something shift inside her again. Not a swell of gratitude that demanded expression, but a quiet understanding that this was not charity, this was not pity, this was balance being restored in a way she had never seen before. She moved to the next bundle, then the next, each one opened with the same care, each one revealing something different, tools worn but strong, lengths of rope coiled neatly, blankets folded against the chill that would come when the sun dropped behind the hills. And as she moved along the line, the ash beneath her boots began to give way to something else, not new soil, not yet, but the suggestion of it, as if the land itself was beginning to remember what it had been before the fire, before the loss. And Margaret felt that memory echo in her own chest, not as longing, but as possibility. The small cloth bundle the young man had placed at the front remained unopened, and she paused before it, her hand resting against her thigh as she looked down at it, sensing that this one carried something different, something that did not belong to the same purpose as the others. And for a moment she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for what it might hold. And then she knelt again, lowering herself slowly until she was level with it, and she reached out, her fingers tracing the edge of the cloth before lifting it gently, unfolding it piece by piece until the contents were revealed. It was not food, not tools, not anything that could be counted or measured in the way the town would understand. It was a small carving, shaped from wood worn smooth by time. The figure simple but deliberate, a woman standing alone, her form steady, her hands at her sides, and though the details were minimal, there was no mistaking what it represented, and Margaret felt her throat tighten slightly, not with tears, but with recognition, the kind that comes when something seen from the outside matches something felt within. She lifted it carefully, turning it once in her hand, and for the first time since the riders had arrived, she glanced back over her shoulder toward the town, her eyes moving across the faces gathered there, not searching for anyone in particular, not accusing, not asking, just seeing them. And what she saw was not the same as it had been the night before. The sharp edges had softened, the certainty had cracked, replaced by something quieter, something that might one day become understanding if it was allowed to. And Margaret did not speak to them, did not offer them what they had not yet earned. She simply held that small carving in her hand and turned back to the field, to the line of what had been given, to the space that was no longer empty. The wind moved again, carrying with it the faint scent of something new, not smoke, not ash, but something cleaner, something that spoke of change in a way that did not demand attention. And Margaret Hale rose slowly to her feet, the pendant in one hand, the carving in the other, and she stood there in the middle of what had once been loss and was now something else entirely, something that did not erase what had happened but stood beside it, steady and unmoving. And for the first time since the night had taken what it had taken, she felt not the absence of what was gone, but the presence of what remained, and it was enough. Margaret Hale did not rush to carry anything inside, did not gather the bundles and hurried arms the way someone might after losing everything, because something in her understood that this was not about replacing what had been taken in a single morning. It was about learning how to stand again in a place that had been emptied, and she moved slowly along the line once more, not opening what was already revealed, but adjusting what had been set down, straightening a fold here, tightening a loose cord there, her hands working with the same quiet care she had given to the man at her fence, as if the act of tending, even now, still mattered more than the things themselves. The town behind her did not disperse right away, though the reason they stayed had begun to change, no longer drawn by spectacle, but held by something they could not quite name. And after a while, one of them stepped forward, not boldly, not with the certainty they had carried the night before, but with hesitation that showed in the way his boots slowed as they crossed the edge of the field. Sheriff Dalton Reeves, his hat held low in his hands rather than resting on his head, his eyes not fixed on Margaret at first, but on the ground before him, as though he were searching for a place to begin that would not undo what had already been done. Margaret heard him before she saw him, the soft crunch of his steps against the dry earth, and she straightened slightly, turning just enough to face him without leaving the line of bundles behind her, the pendant still resting in one hand, the small carving in the other, and she did not speak, did not offer him an opening, because if he had something to say, it was not hers to make easier. He stopped several feet away, far enough to respect the space, close enough to be heard without raising his voice. And for a moment he stood there, the silence stretching between them in a way that felt different from before, heavier not with judgment, but with the weight of something unspoken that had finally found its moment. "Mrs. Hale," he said at last, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, stripped of the authority he usually carried like a badge even when it was not visible, and he paused again, as if the name itself required more care than he had given it in the past, and Margaret watched him, not cold, not welcoming, simply present, the same way she had been all morning. "What happened last night?" he began, then stopped, his eyes lifting briefly toward the field, toward the line of what had been placed there, and something in his expression shifted, not confusion, not disbelief, but something closer to recognition, as if he was seeing a part of the world he had always stood in but never truly looked at. And when he looked back at her, the words that followed came slower, more deliberate. "Should not have happened," he finished, and though the sentence was simple, it did not sound like a statement of law. It sounded like something personal, something he was only just beginning to understand. Margaret held his gaze for a moment, long enough to see that whatever he had come to say was not complete, not yet, and she did not nod, did not accept or reject what he had offered, because she knew that some words, once spoken, required more than a response. They required time to become true. "I cannot change what was done," he continued, his grip tightening slightly around the brim of his hat, "but I can make sure it does not happen again." And there it was, not an apology shaped to ease his own conscience, not a promise meant to restore order in the way the town understood it, but something smaller, more honest, and Margaret felt that same quiet shift inside her, the one that had begun when the riders had arrived, the one that did not erase the past but allowed something new to stand beside it. She glanced once more at the bundles, at the carving in her hand, at the pendant that had come to mean more than its size could explain, and then she looked back at him, her voice steady when she spoke. "See that you do," she said, and there was no sharpness in it, no edge meant to wound, just a clear line drawn in the same quiet way her fence had once stood, a boundary not of wood, but of expectation. The sheriff nodded, once, slow and certain, as if accepting something that could not be argued with, and he stepped back without another word, returning to the edge of the field where the others stood, and one by one, as if taking their cue from him, the townspeople began to turn away, not all at once, not in shame or in fear, but in a kind of thoughtful silence, the kind that comes when a person realizes that what they believed to be simple was never simple at all. Margaret watched them go only for a moment, then turned back to the field, to the work that waited, because life, even after everything, still asked to be lived, and she moved toward the nearest bundle again, this time lifting it with both hands, feeling its weight settle into her arms, real and solid, and she carried it toward what remained of her home, not as someone starting over from nothing, but as someone who had seen what remained when everything else was stripped away and understood that it was enough to begin again. The sun had climbed higher by the time Margaret Hale carried the third bundle inside what remained of her home, its light no longer soft and distant, but steady and present, casting long lines through the gaps where walls once stood, illuminating dust that drifted slowly in the air like something undecided between settling and rising again, and she moved through it with a calm that did not come from certainty, but from acceptance, the kind that does not rush to fill silence, but allows it to exist without fear. She set the bundle down beside the others she had already brought in, arranging them not by size or weight, but by purpose. Food near the corner where her old stove still stood, tools along the wall that had not fully given way, blankets folded over the back of a chair that had survived the night by chance or by stubbornness. And as she worked, she found herself falling into a rhythm she had known long before loss had interrupted it, a rhythm built not on abundance, but on care, on making what you have matter because it is what you have. The small carving she placed near the window frame, where light could reach it in the mornings, not as decoration, but as something to be seen, something to remind her of a moment that had not asked for recognition but had left it anyway, and the pendant she kept with her, slipping it into the pocket of her apron where her hand could find it without looking, the metal now familiar, its weight no longer foreign but steady, like a quiet companion she had not expected to gain. Outside, The field had begun to change in ways that would not be noticed by someone passing through quickly, but Margaret saw it. The way the ash no longer lay as thick where the bundles had been placed, the way the ground beneath seemed to hold itself differently, not healed, not restored, but altered, as if something had been acknowledged and accepted, and she paused at the doorway for a moment, looking out across the land that had once been hers in the way people speak of ownership, and now felt hers in a way that had nothing to do with possession. The town remained quiet, though life had begun to stir again, a wagon rolling slowly down the main path, a door opening and closing without urgency, voices low and measured rather than sharp and certain, and Margaret knew that what had happened that morning would not be spoken of in the same way by everyone. Some would try to explain it, to fit it into the shape of what they already believed. Others would leave it untouched, unwilling to disturb something they did not understand. But either way, it would remain, not as a story told loudly, but as something carried quietly, the kind that changes a person without asking for acknowledgement. She stepped back outside, the air warmer now, carrying with it the faint scent of dry grass and distant water, and she moved toward the remaining bundles, lifting them one by one, not hurried, not delayed, simply continuing, because there was still work to be done, and work, she had learned, was often the clearest way forward when the path itself was not yet visible. As she bent to pick up another bundle, she noticed something she had not seen before, not because it had not been there, but because her eyes had not yet been ready to find it. A set of footprints at the far edge of the field, not leading toward her, but away, smaller than the others, lighter, as if the person who made them had stepped carefully, leaving only what was necessary behind, and Margaret straightened slowly, her gaze following the path they traced until they disappeared into the open land beyond. And she understood then that not everything that had come to her that morning had stayed. Some things had simply passed through, leaving their mark not in what they gave, but in what they revealed. She stood there for a moment longer, the bundle resting in her hands, the field quiet again in a way that felt different from before, not empty, not waiting, but settled, and she realized that the feeling that had followed her since the night before, that sense of something unfinished, had shifted once more, not gone, but changed into something steadier, something that did not ask what would happen next, but trusted that whatever came would meet her where she stood, not as someone broken, not as someone owed, but as someone who had already chosen who she would be when the moment came, and had not turned away. Margaret Hale adjusted her grip on the bundle, turned back toward her home, and walked forward without hesitation, the ground firm beneath her feet, the light steady on her back, and the quiet around her no longer something to endure, but something she could carry with her, step by step, into whatever came next. The afternoon stretched slowly across the land, the kind of long, quiet stretch that gave a person time to hear things they usually walked past, and Margaret Hale found herself listening more than working for a while, standing just outside the doorway of her half-broken home, one hand resting against the frame, the other brushing lightly over the fabric of her apron where the small silver pendant lay hidden but present, and the wind had settled into a softer rhythm now, no longer carrying the sharp scent of ash, but something gentler, something closer to dry grass and distant water, and it moved through the field in low whispers that seemed to pass between the ground and the sky without asking for attention. She had brought in nearly all of the bundles by then, leaving only a few at the edge where her fence had once stood, not because she had forgotten them, but because she had chosen to, because something in her felt that not everything needed to be gathered at once, that some things could remain where they had been placed, at least for a little while longer, as if they were still part of the moment that had brought them there. The carving by the window caught the light differently now, the sun angled just enough to cast a thin shadow behind it, stretching the simple shape across the rough wood of the wall, and Margaret paused to look at it again, not studying it, not questioning it, just seeing it, the quiet strength in its form, the way it stood without movement yet seemed full of it, and she felt that same steadiness settle in her chest again, not as something new, but as something she had always carried and was only now beginning to recognize. A sound reached her then, not loud, not sudden, but distinct enough to pull her attention from the stillness, the slow approach of footsteps along the path that led from the town, and she turned her head slightly, not expecting trouble, not expecting anything at all, just acknowledging that something else was entering the quiet she had come to understand. It was not the sheriff this time, nor a group, but a single figure, moving carefully across the dry ground, a woman from the town, Mrs. Eleanor Pike, older than Margaret by a few years, her posture usually sharp, her voice known for carrying farther than necessary. Yet now she approached with a different kind of presence, her hands held close in front of her, not in defense, not in authority, but in something closer to uncertainty, and Margaret watched her come without stepping forward, without retreating, simply waiting, the same way she had waited the night before when a stranger had appeared at her fence. Eleanor stopped just short of the line where the bundles had been placed, her eyes moving over them briefly before lifting to Margaret's face. And for a moment she said nothing, the words she had likely carried with her seeming to shift and settle before finding their place. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than Margaret had ever heard it. "I did not come this morning," she said, and the sentence hung there, incomplete in its explanation but full in its meaning, and Margaret understood it without needing the rest, understood that this was not a statement of absence, but of recognition, of something missed, something seen too late or from too far away. Margaret inclined her head slightly, not in agreement, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement, allowing the words to stand as they were, and Eleanor took a small step forward, her gaze dropping briefly to the nearest bundle before returning. "Again, I thought I knew what was right," she continued, her hands tightening together for a moment as if holding on to something that no longer fit as it once had. "But I see now that I only knew what was easy." And there was no defense in her tone, no attempt to balance what had been done with what was now being said, only a quiet admission that settled into the space between them without resistance. Margaret listened, not interrupting, not filling the silence that followed, because she knew that this, too, was part of what had begun that morning, not just the arrival of those who had come from beyond the town, but the shifting of those within it, the slow turning of something that had been fixed for too long. "I brought this," Eleanor said after a moment, and she lifted one hand, revealing a small cloth-wrapped item Margaret had not noticed before, holding it out but not crossing the line to place it among the others, waiting instead, and Margaret stepped forward then, just enough to meet her at that invisible boundary, her hand reaching out to take the offering, their fingers brushing only briefly before separating again. And when Margaret unwrapped the cloth, she found a simple loaf of bread, still warm, its surface marked by the careful work of hands that had taken time to make it right, and she looked up, meeting Eleanor's eyes once more, and saw there not certainty, not expectation, but something quieter, something that did not demand to be accepted, only offered. Margaret nodded once, small and steady, and Eleanor returned the gesture before stepping back, not lingering, not waiting for more, and she turned to walk back toward the town the same way she had come, her steps no longer hesitant, but measured, as if something inside her had found a new place to stand. Margaret watched her go for a moment, then looked down at the bread in her hand, the warmth of it real and immediate, and she understood that what had happened that morning had not ended with the riders leaving the field. It had only begun, moving now in quieter ways, in smaller steps, carried not by hundreds, but by one, then another, and she turned back toward her home, the loaf held carefully. The field behind her no longer a place of loss, but a place where something had taken root, something that would not grow all at once, but would remain, steady and unseen, until it was needed again. The warmth of the bread lingered in Margaret Hale's hands long after she stepped back inside, its scent filling the small space that had once been her kitchen, weaving itself through the faint traces of smoke and dust that still clung to the walls, and she set it down carefully on the wooden table that had survived more by luck than by strength, her fingers resting on its surface for a moment as if acknowledging not just the food itself, but the quiet intention that had brought it there, and, for the first time since the morning began, she allowed herself to sit. The chair creaked beneath her, familiar in a way that felt grounding, and she looked around at what remained of her home, the uneven walls, the scattered light slipping through the gaps, the bundles she had arranged with care, and she realized that while the shape of her life had changed, its center had not. It was still here, still held together by the same steady choices she had always made, choices that had not asked for approval, only for courage. Outside, The sound of the town continued to shift, not returning to what it had been, but not as still as before, a balance forming between movement and thought, and Margaret listened to it without needing to understand every piece, because she knew that whatever had begun that morning would take time to settle into something lasting, something that would not disappear with the setting sun. She reached for the loaf again, breaking off a small piece, the crust giving way with a soft crack, the inside still warm, and she held it for a moment before taking a bite, not out of hunger alone, but out of recognition, tasting not just the bread, but the effort behind it, the change it represented, and she closed her eyes briefly as she chewed, letting the moment exist without rushing past it. When she opened them again, her gaze fell on the carving by the window, the simple figure standing in quiet strength, and she found herself studying it more closely this time, noticing the small details she had missed before, the slight curve of the shoulders, the way the base was shaped to stand firm even on uneven ground, and she wondered, not for the first time, who had made it, what hands had shaped it, what story had been carried into its form, and whether it had been carved before or after the man she had helped had come to her fence. And the thought did not bring questions that needed answers, only a sense that everything connected in ways that were not always meant to be traced. The light shifted again as the afternoon began to lean toward evening, the shadows stretching longer across the floor, and Margaret rose from the chair, moving with the same quiet purpose she had carried all day, taking the remaining piece of bread and stepping back outside, the air cooler now, the wind carrying a different tone, something that spoke of the day beginning to close, and she walked to the edge of the field once more, stopping where the last of the bundles had been placed, now fewer in number, but no less present. She looked out across the land, her eyes following the line where the riders had come and gone, the path now empty but not forgotten, and she felt that same steadiness settle in her again, deeper this time, not just in response to what had happened, but as part of who she had become through it. A sound behind her drew her attention again, softer than before, almost hesitant, and when she turned, she saw another figure approaching, younger this time, a boy no older than 14, his hat too large for his head, his steps uneven as if he was not yet used to carrying himself with purpose, and he stopped several feet away, his eyes flicking briefly to the ground before lifting to meet hers, and Margaret waited, giving him the same space she had given the others, the same quiet that allowed words to find their way when they were ready. "My ma said I should bring this," he said, his voice uncertain but clear, and he held out a small bundle wrapped in cloth, his hands steady despite the hesitation in his tone, and Margaret stepped forward to meet him, her movements calm, her expression unchanged, and she took the bundle from him, their fingers brushing lightly before he pulled back, and she nodded once, the gesture simple but enough, and the boy returned it, a small, quick motion before he turned and hurried back toward the town, his steps faster now, as if the act of coming had been harder than the leaving. Margaret unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing a handful of seeds, small and dry, their shapes unremarkable but their meaning clear, and she held them in her palm, feeling their light weight, understanding without needing to be told what they were meant for, not food for today, not tools for tomorrow, but something for later, something that required time, patience, and belief in something that could not yet be seen. She closed her hand gently around them, not gripping, not claiming, simply holding, and she looked out over the field once more, the ground still marked by ash, still uneven, still carrying the memory of what had been lost, and yet now it held something else as well, something waiting, something possible, and Margaret Hale stood there in the fading light, the bread in one hand, the seeds in the other, and she understood that what had begun with a single act had not ended with the riders leaving, or the bundles being placed. It had continued, quietly, steadily, moving through people one by one, changing not just what they did, but how they saw, and she turned back toward her home, the evening settling around her like a promise that did not need to be spoken, only lived. The evening settled in slow and steady, the kind that did not arrive all at once, but revealed itself in layers, light fading from gold to amber, then into the quiet blue that stretched across the open land, and Margaret Hale stood at the edge of her doorway with the seeds still resting in her palm, their small shapes pressing lightly against her skin, reminding her of something that had not yet taken form, something that asked for patience rather than certainty. The field before her had grown still again, not empty, not waiting, but resting, as if the land itself understood that after all that had passed through it that day, there was nothing left to prove, only something to hold. She stepped forward slowly, her boots pressing into the ground with a softer sound than before, the ash no longer as loose, the surface beginning to settle under its own weight, and she moved toward a patch of earth near. Where her fence had once stood, a place where the soil showed through more clearly, darker, firmer, as if it had been waiting beneath everything else for its turn to be seen. She crouched there without hesitation, her movements steady despite the long day behind her, and she opened her hand, letting the seeds rest in her palm for a moment longer before selecting a few, just enough, not all, because something in her knew that beginnings did not require everything at once. They required only what was needed to start. With her fingers, she pressed into the soil, not digging deep, just enough to make space, the earth yielding slightly beneath her touch, and she placed the seeds there one by one, covering them carefully, not burying them, but settling them in, as if tucking them into something that would hold them until they were ready to rise. She did not speak while she worked, did not mark the moment with anything beyond the act itself, because she understood that this was not a gesture meant to be seen. It was something quieter, something that belonged to the space between what had happened and what would come next. When she finished, she rested her hand lightly on the ground for a moment, feeling its steadiness, its quiet strength, and then she rose, brushing the dust from her palms without urgency, her gaze lifting once more across the field, now dim under the fading light, and she noticed how the line where the bundles had been placed earlier still held its shape, even with most of them now carried inside, a memory traced into the land not by force, but by intention. A faint sound reached her then, not from the town this time, but from farther out, beyond the rise where the riders had disappeared, something carried on the evening air, too distant to be clear, but steady enough to be recognized as movement. And Margaret listened for a moment, not searching for meaning, not expecting return, just acknowledging that the world beyond her field still existed, still moved, still carried its own stories across the same sky that now darkened above her. She turned back toward her home, the doorway framed by shadows now, the light inside softer, held by a single lantern she had lit earlier, its glow warm against the rough wood, and she stepped inside, closing the distance with the same calm she had carried all day, setting the remaining seeds on the table beside the loaf of bread, the two resting there together in quiet contrast, one ready to be used, the other waiting for time to shape it into something more. She sat again for a moment, not from weariness alone, but from reflection, her eyes moving across the space, the bundles, the carving, the small signs of a life that had not ended, only shifted, and she realized that what had changed most was not what she had lost or gained, but the way she now saw the space around her, not as something fragile, not as something easily taken, but as something built from choices that could not be undone by a single night. Outside, the town had grown quieter again, the sounds of the day fading into the kind of stillness that comes when people begin to think rather than speak. And Margaret knew that not everything would be different tomorrow, not every voice would change, not every belief would soften, but something had begun, something that would not be easily forgotten, because it had not arrived with force, it had arrived with presence, with a quiet that asked to be noticed rather than feared. She reached into her apron and drew out the pendant once more, holding it in her hand as the lantern light caught its surface, the etched lines reflecting softly, and she turned it once between her fingers before setting it beside the carving near the window, placing them together without ceremony, as if they had always belonged in the same place. And she stood there for a moment longer, looking at them, not searching for meaning, but recognizing it all the same. Then she turned away, moving toward the small space that remained of her bed, the night settling fully around her now, not heavy, not uncertain, but steady, and as she lay down, the quiet of the day remained with her, not as something that needed to be held on to, but as something that had already become part of her, and outside, beneath the darkening sky, the small seeds rested in the earth, unseen, untouched, and already beginning their work. The night passed without interruption, not in the way storms pass or restless thoughts keep a person awake, but in a steady, unbroken quiet that allowed the land and everything upon it to settle into itself. And when morning came, it did not arrive with urgency. It arrived gently, light spreading across the horizon in a pale wash that touched the edges of Margaret Hale's home before finding its way through the gaps in her walls, illuminating the small space with a calm that felt earned rather than given. She woke as she always had, not to a sound, not to a call, but to the shift of light and the rhythm of breath returning to purpose. And for a moment she remained still, her eyes open, her thoughts not rushing ahead but resting in the present, aware of the quiet, aware of the weight of the day before, and the way it had settled into something she could carry without strain. When she rose, her movements were unhurried, her feet finding the floor with familiarity, and she stepped toward the window where the carving stood, its shadow now shorter in the early light, the form unchanged yet somehow more grounded, and beside it the pendant rested where she had placed it, the silver catching the morning in a way that felt less like reflection and more like memory, and she reached out, not to take it, but to touch it lightly, as if confirming that what had happened was not something that had faded with the night. Outside, the field looked different again, not in shape, not in structure, but in presence, the ash no longer the first thing the eye settled on, the ground beneath it more visible now, more defined, and Margaret stepped out into the morning air, the coolness brushing against her skin with a clarity that carried no weight from the day before, only the promise of what might be built from it. She walked to the place where she had pressed the seeds into the earth, her gaze lowering naturally to the spot, and though nothing had yet broken the surface, nothing had yet changed in a way that could be seen, she felt no impatience, no doubt, only a quiet recognition that some things began long before they showed themselves, and she stood there for a moment, her hand resting lightly against her side, the other brushing against her apron, the habit of checking the pendant still present even, though it now lay behind her inside, and she realized that she no longer needed to carry it to feel what it represented. A sound came from the town then, clearer than before, not hesitant, not uncertain, but purposeful, and Margaret turned her head slightly, watching as two figures made their way down the path, not slowly, not cautiously, but with a kind of quiet resolve that had not been there the day before, and as they came closer, she recognized them. Thomas Grady, a man who had kept mostly to himself, his work steady, his voice rarely raised, and beside him his daughter, no older than 10, her small steps, matching his longer ones with careful attention, and they carried something between them, a length of wood, straight and solid, worn but strong. They stopped at the edge of the field, not crossing immediately, not assuming their place, and Thomas shifted his grip on the wood before speaking, his voice even, not loud, not seeking to carry beyond where it needed to be heard. "We thought you might need this," he said, and Margaret looked at the piece they held, understanding before he finished, understanding not just the object, but the intention behind it, and she stepped forward, closing the distance just enough to meet them at that same invisible line that had come to mean more than any fence ever had. She reached out, taking one end of the wood as Thomas released it, his daughter watching quietly, her eyes moving between them, not with fear, not with confusion, but with a kind of openness that had not yet learned to narrow itself, and Margaret nodded once, a small, steady motion that required no further words, and Thomas returned it, the exchange simple, complete, and he turned back without lingering, his daughter following, though she glanced back once, her gaze meeting Margaret's for a brief moment before she looked ahead again, her steps light but certain. Margaret stood with the length of wood in her hands, its weight familiar, its purpose clear, and she turned toward the field, walking to where the old fence line had once stood, the memory of it still traced in the ground, and she set the wood down carefully, not placing it as a barrier, not raising it to divide, but laying it along the line as a marker, something to be built from, something that would not close the land, but define it in a way that honored what had been and what had changed. She stepped back, her hands empty now, her gaze moving across the field, the home behind her, the town beyond, and she understood that what had begun with a single act had moved beyond her, beyond the man she had helped, beyond the riders who had come. It had taken root in the spaces between people, in the choices they now made when no one was watching, and as the sun rose higher, casting light across the land that no longer felt divided in the same way. Margaret Hale stood there, not waiting for what would come next, but ready for it, because whatever it was, it would meet her on ground she had already chosen to stand upon. By midday, the light had settled into a steady brightness that left no room for shadows to hide in, and Margaret Hale moved through it with the same quiet purpose that had carried her since the morning began, her hands no longer uncertain, no longer testing each step, but working with a rhythm that felt both familiar and newly earned, and the length of wood Thomas Grady had brought lay where she had placed it, marking the old line not as a boundary that kept others out, but as a starting point for something that could be built with intention rather than fear. She knelt beside it again, her fingers brushing along its grain, feeling the small imperfections that came from years of use, and she began to set it into place, not raising a fence as it had once been, but anchoring it into the ground with care, pressing the earth around it until it held firm. And as she worked, she did not rush, did not measure the progress by how much was done, but by how steady each movement remained, because she understood now that what she was building did not need to stand all at once, it needed to stand true. The town watched, though not all at once and not all from the same place, some from doorways, some from the path, some from a distance where they could still pretend they were only passing by. But Margaret felt their presence in the way the air shifted, in the way the quiet carried weight rather than emptiness, and she did not look up to meet their eyes, not because she avoided them, but because she no longer needed to. Whatever had needed to be seen had already been seen. Another figure approached as the sun climbed higher, not hurried, not hesitant, but steady, and when Margaret glanced up briefly, she saw it was old Mr. Callahan, a man who had lived in the town longer than most could remember, his back bent with years but his steps still sure, and he carried nothing in his hands, no bundle, no offering, only himself, and when he reached the edge of the field, he did not stop. He stepped across the line without pause, not as a challenge, not as a claim, but as someone who had decided that whatever had stood there before no longer held the same meaning. He came to stand beside her, not too close, not too far, and for a moment he said nothing, his gaze following her hands as she worked the wood into the earth, and then he lowered himself slowly to one knee, his joints stiff but determined, and he placed his hand against the ground beside hers, pressing the soil in place with a care that matched her own, and Margaret did not speak, did not question. She simply shifted slightly to make space, allowing him to work beside her without needing permission, because some things, once understood, no longer required it. They worked in silence for a while, the two of them anchoring the wood, setting it firm, the rhythm of their movements falling into an unspoken pattern, and after a time, another joined, then another, not all at once, not in a rush, but in the same steady way everything else had come that day, one person stepping forward, then the next, each bringing nothing more than their hands, their time, their choice to be part of something they had not created but could help carry forward. Margaret felt it build around her, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as presence, the kind that did not demand to be acknowledged, only shared, and she continued her work, her focus not on who had come or who had not, but on what was being done, because that was where the truth of the moment lived, not in words, not in gestures meant to be seen, but in the quiet act of doing what was right when no one required it. The line of wood began to take shape, not a barrier, not a wall, but a simple structure that marked the land in a way that felt honest, and as the sun began to lean westward, casting longer shadows across the field, Margaret stepped back for a moment, straightening her back, her hands resting at her sides, and she looked at what had been built, not measuring it against what had been lost, but seeing it for what it was, something new, something chosen, something that stood because people had decided it should. The others stepped back as well, not all at once, not in unison, but gradually, each returning to their place, their work complete for now, and no one spoke, no one called attention to what had been done, because it did not need it, and Margaret remained there for a moment longer, her gaze steady, her breath even, and she realized that what had begun as a single act had moved beyond even what she had thought possible. It had become something shared, something carried not by one person or one moment, but by many, each adding to it in their own quiet way. She turned then, walking back toward her home with the same calm she had carried all day. The field behind her no longer marked by what had been taken, but by what had been built in its place. And as the lights softened toward evening once more, Margaret Hale did not feel the need to look back, because she knew that what stood there would remain, not because it was strong, but because it had been made with something stronger than strength. The lights softened again as the day began to close, stretching long across the field in quiet gold, and Margaret Hale stood just outside her doorway, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her posture no longer marked by what had been lost, but shaped by what had been carried through it, and the line of wood that now marked the edge of her land stood simple and steady, not tall, not imposing, but present in a way that did not need to prove itself, and she looked at it not as something finished, but as something begun, something that would hold not because it kept others out, but because it reminded those who saw it what had once been misunderstood and what had now been seen clearly. The people who had worked beside her had long since returned to their homes, not with the noise of accomplishment, not with the pride that seeks recognition, but with a quiet that suggested they understood the weight of what had been done, and the town itself seemed to settle into a different kind of stillness, not the uneasy silence of avoidance, but the calm that follows when something true has been acknowledged and does not need to be argued with. Margaret stepped forward slowly, walking along the line, her fingers brushing lightly over the wood as she passed, not checking it, not testing it, simply feeling its presence, the way it had been placed by many hands, each one adding something that could not be seen but could be felt. And when she reached the end, she stopped, turning her gaze out across the open land beyond, the same land that had carried a man to her fence, that had brought riders in silence, that had returned something far greater than what had been given. And she realized then that the land had not changed at all. It had always been what it was. It was the people who had changed in the way they stood upon it. The evening air moved gently, carrying with it the faint sound of distant movement, not near enough to be seen, not clear enough to be named, but steady, and Margaret did not look for it, did not try to trace its source, because she understood now that not everything needed to be followed to be known. Some things simply needed to be acknowledged and allowed to pass. She turned back toward her home, the light behind her now softer, the shadows longer, and she stepped inside, the small space holding the warmth of the day, the bundles arranged, the bread resting on the table, the carving and pendant near the window where the last light of the sun caught them in a quiet reflection, and she paused there for a moment, her eyes moving between them, not searching, not questioning, only seeing, and she reached out, her fingers touching the carving first, then the pendant, the two resting side by side like something that had always belonged together, and she did not move them, did not change their place, because she understood that their meaning was not in where they were, but in what they had come to represent. Outside, the first hint of night began to settle, the sky deepening, the air cooling, and Margaret stepped back to the doorway once more, looking out across the field one last time before the light faded completely, and her gaze moved to the place where she had pressed the seeds into the earth, the ground still unbroken, still quiet, and yet she felt no impatience, no need to see what would come from it, because she knew that what had been planted there did not require watching, it required trust, the same trust that had guided her hand when she had offered a bowl of soup to a stranger, the same trust that had allowed her to stand when everything else had fallen away. She remained there for a moment longer, the quiet settling around her not as something empty, but as something full, and then she stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her, not to shut the world out, but to mark the end of the day, and as the darkness took its place, there was no sense of loss in it, no shadow that carried fear, only the steady presence of something that had been earned, something that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. And out there, beneath the darkening sky, the land held what had been given to it, the seeds resting in the soil, unseen and unchanged for now, but already becoming something more, something that would rise in its own time, not because it was forced, not because it was expected, but because it had been placed there with care, and that was enough.